Hi, welcome to this short presentation, which is going to be all about my process and thoughts behind my project Digital Double, which is a audio-visual installation about digital identity and personhood in the context of AI curation and assistance. I see this presentation kind of as a reflection and simultaneously an artist statement, and so I hope that the contents will be satisfactory for both those purposes. This is an installation I was lucky enough to host this spring at College of the Atlantic, and so this is just a couple pictures, one of me in front of the main monitor of the installation, and one of my wonderful co-author, the beautiful and super sweet Teddy Bingle. So before we go into the ideas behind the project, I'd like to talk a little bit about the technical aspects, both the actual structure of the installation, just materially in the space, and also some of the logic behind the installation. So this is going to be first by exploring these little prototype diagrams, and then by looking at the actual code that runs the installation behind the scenes. So on the left here you have this little diagram that shows this map of what the project would be like in this ideal. In practice it turned out a little bit differently because I didn't have access to as many projectors as I would have needed, and because it's very difficult to connect computers to lots of projectors at the same time. But in principle, the idea was to have a central TV displaying images of rotating face with various distortions added to them, and around this, in a square room, you would have 4 projectors projecting on every wall that would be showing these same faces but with various distortions that are slightly different, and that are that turn on and off at random moments, such that there's always at least one screen on, and either the central TV is on, or all of the other screens are on, or a combination of everything is on. And on the right you have a little logic diagram that shows some of the internal logic of the installation. The idea at this point in the project, when I made this, was that it was essentially what I just said. So this sort of describes the idea a little bit in a little bit more detail. So you have a random selection process that chooses a type of animation of this rotating face model to play, and types of effects and types of playback. And then there is a process that plays it, flips a coin, and then decides again, or starts playing the central video on the central monitor, at which point all of these other ones would turn off. So for context, this project actually started as a prototype for an assignment in my first year at College of the Atlantic for a class called History of Video Art with Colin Capers, and the 3D model of a human face that I ended up using was a 3D model of Colin Capers' faces, which I made using pictures that I took of their face and then reassembled into a 3D model through photogrammetry using a tool called Agisoft Photoscan. This is a really old screenshot from when I actually put the model together. This should be a fairly intuitive visualization of the project. There's this central CRT computer monitor that projects these images of the rotating face, and then there's a random selection process that triggers different videos of different types of effects and different playback speeds and different settings in different moments. The effects are a mix of green screens, overlaying different types of videos, and a scan wrap with a time offset so that each row of this original video, the rotating face 3D model, is being displaced in time. And then the color effects are just saturation boosts and color swaps that are chosen according to random selection, but it's biased so that it will choose palettes that I find interesting. So I'm going to pause this a little bit There's also an audio it's just going to be a bit too much. So there's the patcher, and then we're going to take a quick look at the inside of the patcher. So the idea of this patcher is when you turn it on, it sends these videos to be read by different players. These little player sub-patches determine the playback settings of the videos, and then here we have this play control sub-patcher, which actually determines the exact settings, the parameters that are being used in the playback. So it decides whether the playback is forward, backwards, and whether it's at normal speed or at twice the speed. Or in the case of these, whether it's normal speed, 1.5 times the speed, or twice the speed. And those speeds can also be negative because the playback can be forward or backwards. The video effects are actually pre-baked using After Effects, and I did try to do some of these effects in Max directly, and I got some fairly good success in reproducing these effects directly in Max, but the issue was driving 5 different screens at the same time from Max and generating those effects together was just too much for my computer, so I ended up abandoning that idea and just pre-baking everything so that I wouldn't have any nasty surprises on the actual day of the exhibit. There is also a chroma key effect here, which merges 2 videos, one of this little sort of hourglass pattern that you get to see here in the background. I called it an hourglass pattern because it's just sort of this array of 3D points that's rotating that I generated in Max using a different patcher that I'm working on currently to do data visualization. And I felt that it conveyed this idea of this this digital void with this kind of spiral funnel and this idea of the passage of time, but through a digital space quite well. So this is why I sort of included it, and it's just a green screen effect, a chroma key that removes a certain color, and that then displays on the background in the background where this color would be the video of the rotating hourglass figure. The audio component of this project is a sort of algorithmic poetry generator, which selects from audio samples from an interview between, like sort of a discussion really between me and Colin Capers, discussing AI curation and AI assistance, in which I was asking different questions about whether they would be comfortable with AI producing AI getting so good that it's able to predict our needs for very mundane life tasks, and these samples are interspersed with some other samples that are just essentially my idea of how a human might browse some thoughts that a human might have browsing the internet about what they might want to buy, how they might want to interact with the space, and also a sort of caricature of what a model of that person through AI might think and the way that they might behave, the kinds of decisions that they might want to make about purchases and about the ways that they want to be in the want is maybe not the right word, but the ways that they would decide, or the ways that they would mechanically end up being in the context of these AI-human interactions as an AI assistant. So the way that this works is it selects a random audio sample, plays it, and simultaneously plays another one. At least one of these is going to be in reverse and the other one is going to be played forwards. one of them is going to be alternating between the left and right channel at random intervals, and one of them is going to be played through the left and right channel. And the volume control is determined according to the random playback settings that are chosen. So in a similar situation, there's this playback control subpatcher which determines how the playback works, and chooses a random playback speed, which can be positive or negative. And depending on that playback speed, the closer it is to original like forward playback at 1:1 speed, the louder the sound will be, and the further away from that it is, the quieter the sound will be. And so that's essentially it for the way that the patcher works. Believe it or not, between the last slide and this slide, there's several days that have passed, and I've been traveling all of this time between the United States and France. It's taken me almost 36 hours to get back to my home in the middle of nowhere, Western Brittany. And so anyway, that's where we're at now. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual installation in the end. In the end, I only had access to 2 projectors and a monitor, and I had to run the program through several different computers due to issues I ran in terms of connecting multiple video outputs simultaneously from my computer, because that's an actual hardware limitation that my computer can't do. And I had to borrow 2 laptops from friends to display the whole thing. But I used I essentially just used a slightly modified version of the program with extra time delays added so that I could set one up and start it playing, and then wait 10 seconds and set the other one up, start it playing, and then set the third one up. And so I have a few pictures and video recordings of the actual installation to give an impression of what the installation might have been like to people who were there on the day.
Every advertisement you decide to watch at the beginning of a YouTube video contributes to building an image of who you are to computer algorithms. Of course, the decisions the software makes are only as good as the software.
I'm considering buying a snowblower. Is there anything behind my beard? No.
If you could experience time differently, how would you like to experience it?
This image is called your digital double. Every advertisement you all our digital devil is.
In order to be able to read my mind and be as bright or dim.
All our digital devil is.
In order to be able to read my mind and be as bright or dim as I want to be. before I was aware that I wanted this bright and probably. Although I'm not sure I would be happy with that if it happened through AI. I don't know. That's really interesting. Yeah. If it were not to happen.
Do you think that artificial intelligence might get to a point where it could predict exactly how you want lights to be, and they will just adjust exactly in that way? This image is called your digital double.
Really 2000 were real.
All our
These are also some pictures of the exhibit that showcase some of the details in a little bit more detail. But I'm going to use these as a backdrop to talk a bit more about what the actual project is about. So, as I conceived it, the idea of the project is to reflect this dynamic between a computer user or someone who will use some kind of a digital interface to connect to the internet and the model of themselves that various companies will make of them in order to advertise to them or to serve them according to their interests, but essentially in order to mediate their online experience. And so the way that I conceived this is by thinking of the digital double as a portrait, and a portrait that would represent this kind of abstract self interacting with the computer. But in some way, this portrait isn't perfect. It's not an exact copy of you. It doesn't represent your interests exactly. In fact, sometimes it might be quite wrong about things. And yet it's still something that might be part of your personality in some way. It's something that is built directly off of your input. And so I think there's a real importance in asking ourselves whether this is part of our own identity or whether this is something else that's run externally, or by virtue of being run externally, that actually isn't part of our own selfhood. I think we might be tempted to default to that conclusion, that the digital double isn't a part of our identity and a part of ourself, but it's essentially the flip side of the coin of our activity online. So it really, in some sense, is directly related to the way that we behave on the internet, and it's directly managed or co-managed by the way that we interact with the internet. So it's sort of an us-shaped something that, or a roughly us-shaped something that exists on the internet to make our interactions with the internet smoother. I sort of picture it as like an us-shaped mold that you can sort of, when you go to the internet, you're kind of like fitting yourself inside this mold. And if this is a good representation of you, then the mold is it fits your actual characteristics and it's comfortable. And if it's a bad representation of you, then the mold is uncomfortable. It doesn't serve you the right things. You're constantly fighting with it in certain ways, and that's experiences that people have as well. Like this, I think on social media quite a lot. I'm constantly fighting recommendation systems to get what I'm interested in, because the image that they have of me is modeled not just on me, but also on all of their other users. And I think that's where it becomes interesting to think about the relationship that this model has to our identity, because it is made through our own data, but it's informed through the data that's provided by the other users that are using the same service that is making a model of us. So another idea that I was really interested in exploring is related to an idea that was explored by Lauren McCarthy in her work. And it's the idea of the level of comfort that we have interacting with these models of us on different services that we use through digital systems. And part of this comfort, I think, comes from a compromise around the level of convenience that we experience using different services. So when we go to our Facebook feed or our Twitter feed or some other service that uses a model of ourself in some way, we experience a very curated experience. And that curated experience is often, when it's good enough, it's enough to let us sort of ignore some of the ethical questions about, well, what should we really be comfortable about the way that our data is being used? Does the representation of this algorithm of me serve my interests? Is it manipulating me in some ways? Is it biased? Is it reinforcing biases that I already have? Is it disincentivizing me from having certain biases against in a way that I should have consented to prior? And so this is something that McCarthy explored in one of her pieces, in which she asked several people to play the role of Alexa insert any AI assistant in their homes and do the same tasks that Alexa might in their homes, but as a human being and not as an algorithm. Joanna Zielinska explores this piece a little bit more in AI Art, Machine Visions and Warped Dreams, where she describes it as an exploration of human-machine interaction through the lens of playfulness, irony, and pastiche, demystifying the grand promises behind some of AI, while also raising the question of the willing suspension of privacy, which only starts feeling weird when the spying is undertaken by a human Alexa. I think this is really interesting and really important. The fact that we're willing to suspend aspects of our privacy when we feel that we're not being served by a person. In some sense, maybe there's a feeling that our data isn't important enough to be scrutinized by an individual. But if a person were to look at the same data, have the same insight into our lives that the algorithm does, then we would be a lot more concerned about that insight that they have, about the ways that impacts our own personal privacy. But then I think it's also important to think about relativizing the actual services that come from these curations through AI systems, because when we go on a website and we have this curated service, the data that we're giving away is a lot of ourselves, and the curation that we're getting in exchange is actually not that much. I mean, we could really subscribe to a few newspapers and things that we enjoy, if you're on Twitter, for example, you could follow, if you're interested in having a curated news feed, you could just follow news organizations that are going to have a human curation that doesn't actually involve you giving away any personal data, and would give you a news feed that corresponds to your interests, that follows certain of your political views, etc., etc. So there is a sense in which it's important to ask whether we really need to compromise on our own personal privacy in order to get the level of curation that we're being given by the systems that are running the internet. For Gilbert Simondon and Bernard Stiegler, the way of understanding the individual is to inscribe the individual in a process in which he is only a phase. And this idea is that multiple individuals are always in the process of being constituted in terms of their interactions, the interactions that they have with each other. So everybody is constantly in a process of becoming. And in this process of becoming, of individuation, that process can include individuals in terms of persons, but it can also include anything that anybody has a relationship to. We build ourselves in relationship to others and to other things, and that includes algorithms. And these algorithms are interesting in that they are not individuals, but they are being made in terms of, they're being made in reaction to these interactions that we have with them. And so it's interesting in terms of considering the people as phases that are constantly parts of this emergent process. What kinds of phases are constituted through AI encounters? Joanna Zielinska asks, what kind of phases are constituted through AI encounters? What kind of AI emerges from these encounters? I want to leave this last question open because I don't think that anybody has an accurate final answer to give on the types of identities that come from the interactions that we have between human beings and AI models at this point. And on top of this uncertainty and this general the diversity of opinion that may exist on this subject, there's also the added complication that these models are constantly being improved and worked on by actual engineers, and that they're changing, the qualities of the algorithms themselves are changing constantly. So I want to leave this as a closing remark, and something that maybe you can think over and explore more on your own time.